war in Ukraine is still ongoing as Putin's army outperforms the media's early expectations and predictions about a stalled and weak Russian military as Putin's forces methodically take one Ukrainian town and city after another. Still no word from Vladimir Putin as to whether he considers the U.S. bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline an act of war. It is. There's a fascinating piece over at The American Thinker written by Alexander Makovsky titled, "Since When Did Ukrainians Become Entitled to the State They Got?" In it, he points out, quote, "The historical record demonstrates that contemporary Ukraine emerged from a mosaic of lands assembled by Russian conquests and paid for with Russian blood and treasure. Except for a small area, Ukraine has no historical connection to the land it occupies and is the product of Russian geopolitical engineering," end quote. Interesting. You certainly won't hear that reporting on any of the mainstream media channels or newspapers, and everyone watching, you should go read it. It's great, but generally, it's a reminder of just how clueless most Americans are when it comes to the historical context of the war between Ukraine and Russia. The situation is far from the black and white, good versus evil scenario professional liars would have you believe. Since early last year, we've been told Volodymyr Zelensky is a hero, a model leader who's been desperately pleading with the West to help defeat the evil Russians in their war of Eastern aggression. Help, of course, has been defined as massive amounts of American taxpayer cash. We've also been told by an eager Biden administration that Putin's war is the sole cause for high gas prices as well as out-of-control inflation that we're all experiencing and seeing. It's not Biden's fault, they say, but more broadly, we've been told the fight for Ukraine is a fight for American values. Virtually every single media outlet, including Fox News, has reported breathlessly about why you, the American people, should care about Vladimir Putin's war with Volodymyr Zelensky. And it's not just the mainstream media. It's Hollywood, the music industry, and professional sports, all in lockstep with the same message. You should care, and care deeply, about the situation in Ukraine. Hollywood certainly cares deeply about the situation in Ukraine because celebrities seem to be ignoring the alleged danger and flock to meetings with Zelensky. This CBS News headline from last year is not an anomaly. Ukraine thanks Ben Stiller, Angelina Jolie, and other stars for visiting despite the danger. The article goes on, quote, Ben Stiller joined a growing list of celebrities who have visited Ukraine to show support during the war with Russia. The country's Department of Defense later thanked Stiller and other stars like Angelina Jolie, Sean Penn, and Liv Schreiber, quote, who despite the danger have visited us, the department wrote in a tweet. In the middle of a supposed war zone, Zelensky also posed with Vogue magazine in a photo shoot. Last year, famous photographer Annie Leibovitz. We remember that. Also, remember back in March and April of last year when virtually every NPC had pictures of Ukrainian flags on their social media profiles. So as we approach the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's long past time to start asking questions. Many have pointed out the connections between Hunter Biden and the oil oligarchs in Ukraine and the Biden family's potential to enrich themselves with Ukrainian and now American sovereign wealth. But a broader point is that the global intelligence community and foreign policy apparatus, along with the military-industrial complex, are using American aversion to Soviet communists to try to lever America into a war with Russia on behalf of Ukraine. But is Russia really representative of the old-school style Soviets we remember from the 1980s Rocky movies, from Red Dawn, and from Sean Connery's Hunt for Red October? Let's take a closer look at that tonight. So we heard Russia, Russia, Russia from Hillary and the Democrats, and even from the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, beginning on day one of Trump's term in office. And we've been hearing Russia, Russia from both the Democrats and from so-called Republicans like Hannity and Levin nonstop after 4 years of calling the Russia hoax a hoax, though. Sean Hannity and a boatload of other D.C.-approved so-called conservative media talking heads, along with every single pro-gay communist Democrat, now expect us to believe that Russia is to blame for the war in Ukraine all of a sudden. So if someone on the street or at a church or family function with friends were to tell you that the Ukraine war was all about fighting for gays, fighting for gay rights, and fighting for LGBTQ and trans rights, you'd probably think they were crazy, right? Well, if the mainstream media, all of whom are loved by big tech's fact-checking regime, are to be believed, the war in Ukraine actually is primarily about fighting for gay rights. And it's not just leftist corporate media telegraphing the real cause of the Ukraine war. It's also the top brass in British and European intelligence communities at places like MI6 and even NATO, one of the true aggressors against Russia, who tells us the reason they're advocating for war comes down to, you guessed it, gay rights. In fact, Richard Moore, the chief of Britain's secret intelligence service, MI6, who also happens to use his preferred pronouns in his Twitter bio, by the way, claims that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is in large part driven by their homophobia towards LGBT plus people and their rights. Moore, who has previously said he was proud to fly the transgender pride flag atop of MI6's London headquarters to celebrate the so-called Transgender Day of Visibility in 2021, has also said trans and non-binary spies have helped make the intelligence service stronger. As detailed by the Daily Mail, Moore has been flying a rainbow flag to mark gay pride since 2015 and has turned the MI6, James Bond, MI6, into one of Britain's top workplaces for LGBTQ employees. And what does Spy Master Richard Moore get for being so openly supportive of gays and transgender members of the clandestine community? Well, of course, he's having praise heaped upon him for his efforts from an activist group called Stonewall in the United Kingdom. So as the war in Ukraine unfolded, the gay-friendly spy chief chimed in on the, quote, destructions unfolding so distressingly in Ukraine, end quote, and suggested that freedom-loving people around the world, quote, remember the values and hard-won freedoms that distinguish us from Putin, none more than LGBT plus rights, end quote. In addition to virtue signaling his support for the LGBTQ community, the sexually non-judgmental spy chief then described the experiences of a queer agent codenamed P, wonder what that stands for, who allegedly told him, quote, I had to move for the job when I joined MI6, so I was relieved to find out there was an LGBT plus network group. Through the group, I've made some great friends in the office, and it's reassuring to know it's there for support if I need it, end quote. Many users on Twitter expressed confusion over Moore's remarks. Quote, my only hope is this is some sort of top secret coded message, otherwise we're all effed, end quote. That's one reply. Critics pointed out, rightly so, that Moore's priorities here, like so many in the West, are misplaced. The spy chief's decision to use a geopolitical issue as a vehicle for his personal pro-gay crusade was not only distasteful, but borderline dangerous given his role in the British government. At a time when the British intelligence agencies ought to be shoring up the country against hostile cyber attacks and espionage, the World Economic Forum assures us are in fact on the way and coming, the last thing on most British citizens' minds and citizens across the world are gay rights in Ukraine. Moore's decision to make the war about gay issues actually came on the heels of the MI6's tweet about the success of the British Ministry of Defense tweeting about and then deleting their, quote, gay coffee morning tweet on the same day Russia invaded Ukraine. Unbelievable. And the United States isn't exempt. Even the United States Department of Defense tells us the war is really all about homosexual, gay, trans, and sodomite rights. And we will prove it to you when we come back. This is the Stu Peters Show. I'm your guest host, Paul Harrell. We'll be back in just a moment. So at first glance, this development about the war in Ukraine, meaning the realization that homosexual rights is at least among the primary causes for war in Ukraine, would seem to be a recent development, but that would not be correct. You see, the goose-stepping gay lobby has been laying the groundwork for at least a decade prior to the outbreak of war in Ukraine. But before we get to the homosexual axe grinding in Ukraine, let's review briefly the warnings NATO, the EU, and the global super-governmental one-world government community had been given far in advance to Ukraine's 2014 revolution. Quote, it would be extraordinarily difficult to expand NATO eastward without those actions being viewed by Russia as unfriendly. Even the most modest schemes would bring the alliance to the borders of the old Soviet Union. Some of the more ambitious versions would have the alliance virtually surround the Russian Federation itself, end quote. Now that's Ted Galen Carpenter. He wrote those words in 1994 in his book Beyond NATO, Staying Out of Europe's Wars. Ted Galen Carpenter is Senior Fellow for Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. Ukraine has long been a pillar of the Soviet Union with strong historic ties to Russia. For Ukraine to join NATO has always been a very obvious red line. Even the Council on Foreign Relations has been forced to admit this fact. Putin even warned America about this red line back in 2008. Quote, no Russian leader could stand idly by in the face of steps toward NATO membership for Ukraine. That would be a hostile act toward Russia. Those are Vladimir Putin's words of warning just ahead of NATO's 2008 Bucharest summit aimed at U.S. Undersecretary for Political Affairs William J. Burns, who later became the director of the CIA. So at a minimum, Putin has been warning the U.S. and NATO for 15 years that NATO encroaching on its border would be a cause for war. So we have to ask ourselves, was it really a random selection when Hillary Clinton decided to use her British intelligence assets to create her entirely fictional PP-Gate dossier, which squarely blamed Trump's alleged election interference on Russia? Russia, of all countries. So then we're forced to listen to 4+ years of the Russian hoax on CNN and 4+ years of Hannity and Mark Meadows and jacketless Jim Jordan refuting the Russian hoax over on Fox. And then all of a sudden, bam! We're expected to flip and now see Russia as the bad guy and send billions to Ukraine because Putin is evil. But rather than giving us a good reason, the leftist media and their counterparts on Fox News can't give us any good reasons except for Putin bad. But if you weren't paying attention to the intelligence community mouthpieces in the mainstream press, what you may have missed, and frankly what many on the right have missed, was the preceding decade-long pressure campaign leading up to the war against Putin in Ukraine. One of, if not the most powerful tools the communist media use to leverage the West into war has been the never-ending war for human rights. You've seen the music videos and the cheesy digital web ads cut by the latest TV or movie stars like George Clooney, whether it's Jim Carrey and a host of celebrities cutting videos to stop human rights abuses in Myanmar, or Peter Cetera's Voices That Care advocating for war in Operation Desert Storm, or Ice Cube staging concerts in Africa, or Lady Gaga taking her Born This Way tour to Moscow, celebrities, without fail, come out of the woodwork to advocate for the gays or against so-called human rights abuses. And the war in Ukraine is no exception, except this time Ukraine has enjoyed broad-based support from the entire war machine and military-industrial complex. The dirt that comprises Ukraine must be some very valuable dirt to earn itself such a prolonged campaign of beating war drums. But what's interesting is the angle of attack. The war in Ukraine, if you listen to the foreign policy community, really is all about gay rights. Maybe this is the one time you can actually believe the media. As far back in 2015, Foreign Policy Magazine, CFR's flagship publication and the preeminent publication for those who practice foreign relations and statecraft on the planet we call Earth, was beating the drums of gay war. In the wake of the Ukrainian 2014 revolution, the conversation centered around forcing Ukraine to adopt European Union and NATO workplace guidelines on, you guessed it, homosexuals. Foreign policy is celebrating Ukraine's supposed progress on homosexual and sodomite rights, but they lament the fact that the progress might only last a few weeks. In 2015, Al Jazeera, apparently the gay-hating Muslims who throw gays and lesbians off buildings, are very pro-homosexual when it means baiting America into war against Russia on behalf of pro-homo NATO. Look at this headline. LGBT gains in Ukraine are in danger, blared the headline. Al Jazeera? Really? During the Trump administration in 2018, Senate Foreign Relations Committee issued a staff minority report. Now, Senator Ben Cardin was the Democratic ranking member on that committee. Senator Marco Rubio was also a member at that time who later pushed for war with Ukraine. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee report detailed what were apparently concerns with how the former nations of the Russian Federation handled sodomite rights. And we have to ask Senator Rubio whether his support for the Ukraine war was based on Senator Cardin's report about gay rights in Ukraine. In June of 2019, the Brookings Institute blared a headline that made very little sense unless you just witnessed a rainbow NATO parade float slowly making its way down a Parisian boulevard. What does a pride parade have to do with NATO? The headline begins. Yes, we agree. Very good question. I mean, perhaps the aforementioned NATO rainbow float scenario is what prompted the question. Maybe I missed the Macy's Day Parade in Paris. I hope I did, in fact. But just in case you thought the question was an absurd one, Brookings redirects you. More than you might think, they tell you. What? Our scenario with a gay rainbow parade float slowly flitting down a Parisian boulevard isn't so absurd, Brookings tells us. You see, it's not just Ukraine, where the international military-industrial complex is aiming its rainbow machine guns. Serbia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had better start catching up on their Will and Grace reruns, or the West might visit war on those tiny little countries next, is the implied threat I read between the lines over at Brookings. As Brookings tells us, the degree of respect for LGBTQ people has increasingly become a measure of democratic health in former Soviet states. While gay rights demonstrations in the Baltics were once met with feces-flinging counter-protesters in 2006, this month's celebration saw no such feces-flinging. It's unclear who precisely Brookings blames the feces-flinging on, the gay pride set or those opposed. But it's not just the pro-homo Brookings Institute pushing the pro-homo agenda. The United States Department of State got in on the low-key saber-rattling, and they did it while Donald Trump was president. Koch Industries tied Mike Pompeo, who served as Secretary of State under President-in-exile Trump, released a detailed report he claims is about human rights. But the report descends into depths of mud sifting you would never expect the State Department to engage in. What should be the premier diplomatic organization on the planet, our U.S. State Department, is investigating, writing, and reporting on local police matters having to do with claimed LGBTQ rights violations in a country 5,000 miles away from Washington, D.C. In 2020, our Department of State was obsessed with little homosexual rights spats writing reports about LGBTQ issues in Ukraine. And this is Trump's State Department under the leadership of Mike Pompeo, who now wants to run for president. Why on earth is the U.S. State Department policing local police matters in Ukraine? And Zelensky was already in charge there in Ukraine. Wasn't Zelensky supposed to be a hero for the gays in Ukraine? I guess he's only a hero if he successfully uses the big gay hate mafia to bash Biden over the head and abscond to Ukraine with billions of our taxpayer dollars. That right there is how one earns gay rights, street cred in the international war community, apparently. And then there's Rick Grenell, Trump's appointed first homosexual DNI, or Director of National Intelligence, and an openly gay man pushing gay issues and working hard to be named the first gay Secretary of State here in the United States. Grenell is sitting up high on a fence post when it comes to the war in Ukraine. He seems to think that it's a bad idea for Putin to invade, but he won't outright oppose the war, instead opting to take the tack that Biden's weakness has caused it, and that leads us to believe he's for the war, which of course would make sense given that he's the first openly gay DNI. But the evidence doesn't stop with the Department of State or Brookings or with the openly gay DNI. In 2020, the Atlantic Council couldn't contain their excitement as they reported how sodomites across Ukraine were cheering the election of, quote, showbiz star Volodymyr Zelensky as the youngest ever president of Ukraine, end quote. The Atlantic Council continued reporting that Zelensky's campaign used many progressive and liberal slogans, fueling hopes for the acceleration of pro-European reforms that would make sodomy and transgenderism a standard of Ukrainian culture. The Atlantic Council just can't contain their exuberance as had the potential of a standard acceptance of sodomy in Ukraine. It's all just so exciting. And then there's NATO. In March of 2021, NATO headquarters hosted its first ever conference on LGBTQ plus perspectives in the workplace. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg addressed the conference on the importance of inclusive leadership, saying, quote, "Every member of the LGBTQ plus community at NATO is a valued member of our staff and family because diversity and inclusion is at the heart of who we are and what we do. Drawing on all resources and all experiences makes us stronger and better equipped to face the future," end quote. NATO further iterated its commitment to diversity, noting that its organizational policy strongly promotes sodomy and transgenderism, a culture that Ukraine would have to embrace and promote as a potential member. But wait a second. I thought NATO was all about defending Western Europe against the godless communist Soviets. You remember your 20th century history, right? I mean, in the aftermath of World War II, the Soviets had taken over a substantial chunk of Eastern Europe. The godless commie Soviets were a big threat to the Western way of life. America, baseball, church on Sunday, apple pie, you get it. So in 1949, the year after Israel was founded, we had to form NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in order to defend Christian Europe against the attacks we were inevitably going to suffer at the hands of the godless communist Soviets, right? Fast forward 70 years later or so, and now NATO is going on offense with countries which are no longer Soviet. And not only is NATO triggering war with non-Soviet nations, it's triggering war with non-Soviet nations in order to push access to homosexuality and sodomy and transgenderism. Who exactly are the godless communists today? And given the cause for war here, perhaps it's time for the United States to reevaluate its role in NATO. And taking all of this into consideration, can we really blame Russia for not wanting NATO at their border? Not only are NATO and Zelensky and Ukraine openly advocating for the proliferation of degeneracy in and around Russia, they're backing up that thrust with the threat of installing many big rockets pushing right next to and even in Russia's back door, no pun intended. That's not something most Americans would be comfortable with. We shouldn't expect Russians to tolerate it either. This is the Stu Peters Show. My name is Paul Harrell, filling in for Stu. We'll be right back with the man, the myth, and the legend, Roger Stone.